Welcome back. With this video, we have reached the 4th chapter, which deals with horror in Japanese video games. In the previous chapters, I always try to start with the earliest traceable works of the respective medium, so the obvious course of action to kick off this chapter would be to ask ourselves, what were the very first Japanese horror games? But, so as to put these findings into perspective, I then decided to pursue a second question, even though this would bring us outside the usual scope of the series for a bit. That question being, what were the very first horror games in the entire world? However, when I set off in search of answers to these two questions, I soon realized that things weren't quite as easy as I thought. Because the earlier the game, the simpler the graphics and mechanics, which in turn means more room to argue whether something can even be considered a horror game. What's more, unlike books and movies, it is more common to classify games by their gameplay than by their content. When people talk about video game genres, you will often hear terms like platformer, racing game, beat 'em up, and so on, especially when talking about older or simpler games. The term horror game, on the other hand, doesn't really describe any particular kind of gameplay and probably only gained traction when games became more cinematic. But that would mean that some of the earliest games with horror content might not even have been labeled as horror games back then, meaning that any genre sorted list we find could be unreliable. Furthermore, the term horror game is a very broad term, and what exactly should or should not be included under its umbrella will greatly depend on how lenient you are with your definition of what makes up a proper horror game. This is of course true for pretty much every argument about genre definitions, but it does feel particularly tricky when it comes to these early and simple games. So, considering the highly subjective nature of this matter, I decided that I will present you with a list of the most noteworthy titles with horror-related contents from the earliest days of video games possible, but I will not give a final verdict when it comes to the question of crowning one or more of those titles as the first proper horror game ever, as I think that is best left up to each individual viewer based on their personal definition of what constitutes a genuine horror game. So let's begin. Chapter 4.1 The first games with horror content in and outside Japan. Before we get started, allow me to explain once more that we will briefly extend our focus and not just look at the very first Japanese video games, but at the very first video games worldwide for the following part. This is done so as to get a better understanding of the general beginnings of horror games, which will in turn allow us to better contextualize the Japanese titles that were found. And so, without further ado, here is the absolute earliest title with horror-related contents that I could discover, which is the US game Haunted House from 1972. It was part of the Magnavox Odyssey, the first video game console ever. This console had been designed by a certain German-American Ralph Henry Baer and was first released in the US in 1972, then overseas a year later. Haunted House was one of the games included in the US version of the console and worked by putting an overlay of a haunted house over your television and using the Magnavox Odyssey controllers to steer squares that will light certain parts of the overlay. One player controlled a detective looking for clues in this haunted house, while another player was in charge of the ghost. And this game is actually immediately a great example of what I meant by the earlier the game, the more room to argue. I mean, clearly it has been designed to look at least somewhat creepy, and the instructions even say the player controlling the ghost in the haunted house has to say boo when they reveal themselves. Quote, "When the detective approaches the clue just before the ghost's hiding place, the ghost reveals himself by pressing his reset button and says boo." Quote end.
No, you scared me.
So there seems to be some kind of desire on the developer's side to present the players with a creepy setting and the chance to cause scares, but at the same time I'm sure a great deal of people would also look at this, shake their heads and say calling that a horror game is a bit of a stretch. But what do you think? Next, there is the US game Mystery House from 1980, released for the Apple II. It was published in the US by Online Systems. This title, designed by Roberta Williams and programmed by Ken Williams, was actually the first graphical text adventure game. Roberta Williams would later be responsible for titles such as King's Quest or Phantasmagoria. In Mystery House, the player gets locked inside a Victorian mansion with other people, only to realize that one of them is a murderer. If the player doesn't want to be among those killed, they have to uncover the identity of this perpetrator. An interesting question is, could this game be considered uncanny? Well, the depiction of dead bodies in this game seems rather comical, and some of the pictures are drawn with such simplicity that they almost look like a children's drawing. But the fact that all of them are almost completely black makes it feel like you're wandering through a mansion at night with no lights on, which actually makes some of the rooms feel oddly quiet, if that makes sense. I look at them and with a lot of imagination could imagine myself standing there in the dead of night while everything around me is dark and quiet in an unsettling way. That's just my personal impression, of course, but I guess it goes to show that there might be some potential there if you look past the extremely simple presentation and immerse yourself in the idea of really being there. Another interesting one I found is the US game The House of Usher from 1980, released for Apple II and Atari 800. It was created by John and Patty Bell, published in the US by Crystalware. This was a sort of weird action game, adventure game, and RPG mix with a fairly undeniable horror setting. It actually looks kinda creepy in its own charming pixelated way, to be honest. I mean, extremely simple sound and graphics aside, it is clearly going for a gloomy and heavy atmosphere with all the thunder, the texts, and the dark setting. On top of that, you have a time limit, and there are monsters inside that abandoned house that are out to murder you, all of which can create tension and fear while playing. Could it be considered uncanny? I think that depends on how much you can bring your brain to translate the plain pixel graphics into the idea of actually being in such a place yourself. As with all these early games, the answer to such questions will greatly vary from person to person. The game does have some moments where the text presents you with somewhat uncanny situations though. Cupboards bare, squeaky laughter behind the walls. Encountering something like that in an abandoned mansion actually sounds pretty terrifying. But okay, moving on. Next up, I finally have for you the first Japanese title with horror-related content that I could find. It's a game that's most likely from 1981, called AX2 Uchuyu Sosen no Sutoromo, which translates to AX2 Space Transport Ship Nostromo. It was released for the Commodore PET-CBM and the NEC PC 6001. The publisher was ASCII Shuppan, which translates to ASCII Publishing, and most sources specify 1981 as the year of its release, although I also found some sources that said 1982. Now, since it was released on two different systems, my best guess is that that's why you can find two different release years, but if anyone knows more about this, feel free to leave a comment. It was developed by Takiguchi Akira and Mitsuhashi Masakuni. However, I also found sources that sounded like Takiguchi programmed it and Mitsuhashi then ported it to another system. It actually contained 4 different games, all using ASCII symbols to create their simple graphics, but the one I want to highlight here is the titular game Nostromo, which must have been inspired by Ridley Scott's movie Alien from 1979. Just like the movie Alien, this game takes place on a spaceship called Nostromo, which has been infiltrated by an alien. The player, represented by a circle, needs to collect resources from various storages on board the ship, while trying to avoid the alien that is constantly hunting them, represented by an @ mark. To add some tension, the player can only enter these storages by creating a hole in the wall, which, however, takes time. Once inside the storage, they are safe from the alien, but only until they leave the storage again. The alien is pretty quick, meaning that even one mistake can mean the player's death. And the fact that opening the storage takes a few frames while the alien keeps closing in on you could actually make for some thrilling moments, despite the fact that the entire game consists of ASCII symbols. Could it be considered uncanny? Well, being hunted by something faster than you can certainly be a scary experience, no matter how simple the graphics. But with regards to the uncanny, I guess the way everything is depicted on screen leaves no uncertainty as to what is happening in every moment, so scary, possibly yes, uncanny, probably not. Next, we're going back outside Japan, because there actually was another haunted house game from the US, released in 1982, although I also found one source that said 1981. And while it had the same title as the haunted house game included in the Magnavox Odyssey in 1972, this one was a very different game, released for the Atari 2600. In this game, which was created by James Andreasen and published by Atari Inc., the player has to traverse a haunted house that consists of 4 different floors in order to find and piece together a broken urn, while trying to not get killed by various monsters. But the twist is that the urn, as well as a few other items that the player can pick up, are actually not visible unless the player lights a match, which can in turn be blown out by monsters. On a higher difficulty level, even the walls of the mansion cannot be seen anymore without a match, which, despite the extremely simple graphics, could actually create quite some tension. Could it be considered uncanny? Not to sound like a broken record, but in my eyes this is basically another case where the answer to that will vastly depend on your imagination. Then there is the British game 3D Monster Maze, released in Europe in February 1982 for the Sinclair ZX81. This game was programmed by Malcolm Evans and based on an idea by J.K. Gray. With regards to this title, I actually came across an interesting article from 2020 by Zach Zwiesen, in which he discusses this game and brings up a possible hint at how one could try and define what makes up a proper horror game. For Zwiesen, the keyword is intent. In other words, for something to count as a proper horror game, there needs to be the conscious intent by the developers to scare and unnerve the player, to make them uncomfortable. Now, the main issue I see with basing an entire definition on intent is that we're not psychics who can see into the mind of the developers, and not every case is as clear-cut as you might want it to be, which means that more ambiguous cases will greatly depend on your own interpretation of the developer's intentions. On the other hand, to a certain degree, horror itself is a subjective thing, so I don't think you can entirely avoid personal interpretations and different points of views either way. Well, I'll let you decide for yourself whether or not this definition is a good one. Personally, I think it does have some merit. But okay, back to 3D Monster Maze. This game puts you into a maze together with a dinosaur, a T-Rex, hence the name. And Zwiesen argues that 3D Monster Maze was the first proper horror game, and playing it, you will quickly notice that in this case there is little doubt that trying to scare the player was on the developers' minds. I mean, look at these texts. He is hunting for you. Rex lies in wait. Footsteps approaching. Sure, there's no music, and it's just a 3D maze, which is kind of amazing in and of itself for 1982 if you think about it. But the fact that something is in there with you, actively trying to hunt you down, looking for you, accompanied by these unsettling messages, simple graphics or not, that's a source of tension and fear. Yeah, that's actually terrifying. Still, was it really the first horror game, as the article claims? Because I think we have already seen a few earlier titles that have the right to call themselves a horror game just as much. So, depending on where you want to draw the line, this wasn't necessarily the first one. And could it be considered uncanny? I can't quite explain why, but yes, I do think that something about the entire game feels strangely uncanny, but what do you think? But okay, let's move on and take a look at a few more from Japan, because next I would like to touch upon a series of Japanese graphic text adventures published by the Nihon Falcom Corporation, a company which would later become famous for its RPG series Ys, Legend of Heroes, and Trails. There is, for instance, the game Horahousu, or Horror House, from 1983, possibly inspired by the previously mentioned graphical text adventure Mystery House from 1980. The game Horahousu was released in 1983 by Falcom for the Japanese NEC PC 8801 and called itself the first in a series of occultic mystery adventure games. There's an S missing there. From Falcom. Apparently, it was originally created by a student of the Japanese Kindai University and then sold by the Nihon Falcom Corporation after they remade some of its graphics. The point of the game is to explore a mysterious house in good old adventure game fashion by reading descriptions of the places you visit, which are accompanied by simple graphics and typing in actions trying to tell the game what you want to do. They also released a sequel just 2 months later called Kyoki no Yakata, which could be translated as Mansion of Madness. The next year, in 1984, Falcom released Demon's Ringu, or Demon's Ring, another graphical text adventure game, also for the NEC PC 8801, which leaned a bit more towards occult fantasy, but also contained some relatively eerie locations. The game actually called itself an occultic fantasy adventure. Finally, there's one more adventure game by Falcom that I would like to mention before we reach the end of this video, namely Ijigen Kara no Dassutsu from 1984, which translates to Escape from Another Dimension. It was also called Escape from Twilight Zone in English on its title screen. This game was released by Falcom in July 1984. For some reason, this one looked particularly interesting to me, and I found a Japanese article which tells of the game's premise. Basically, it goes like this. The unnamed protagonist is a salad salaryman who has just finished a mountain of work only to realize that it's already 1 o'clock in the morning. Heading home in the dead of night, he walks down a lonely street with no one around when suddenly thick fog begins to engulf him. He becomes frightened and starts running, desperate to get home. Eventually he reaches a door. Thinking it to be the entrance to his house, he is about to open it when he notices how mistaken he was, as he actually stands in front of a telephone booth. Inside, the telephone is ringing, and for some reason the protagonist decides to open the door to the telephone booth and pick up the receiver, when suddenly he falls down into a dark abyss. As he regains consciousness, he finds himself in the middle of a dark forest. After wandering about aimlessly for a while, he comes to the conclusion that he isn't dreaming, but has in fact been transported into some other dimension and has to find a way back to his own world. I haven't played it myself, but just going by the premise and the images, this looks like a fairly interesting and possibly creepy title. It was partially a graphical text adventure accompanied by eerie images in the first half, and a sort of 3D maze game in the second half. Among these horror-related titles released by the Nihon Falcom Corporation, I think Ichigen Kara no Dashutsu actually has a certain uncanny quality to it. The entire idea of being pulled into a weird dimension that is not your own, that pretty much places you inside strange and unfamiliar territory, surrounded by uncertainty, so yeah, I think this one has potential. Alright, and with that, I have reached the end of the list of very early games with horror content that I wanted to show you. To sum up, some sources define the British title 3D Monster Maze from 1982 as the earliest horror video game that ever existed. However, I would argue that we have seen a few even earlier titles in this video which contained horror-related elements and which felt like there was a conscious intent to scare or frighten the player, thus making them also eligible for the title of earliest horror game ever. At the same time, it's far from easy to define what constitutes a proper horror game in the time of simple graphics and mechanics, and therefore I had ultimately decided against giving a definite verdict on this matter and instead elected to simply show you a chronological list of the most noteworthy titles with horror elements from the earliest days of video games. And with regards to Japan specifically, the most notable titles were the ASCII-based AX2 Uchu Yuso Sen no Sudoromo from 1981, although as stated before I also found sources that said Nostromo was from 1982. This title showed some inspiration from the American movie Alien from 1979, and while it wasn't exactly uncanny, its mechanic of being hunted by something faster than you while trying to enter small rooms could certainly cause fear in some players despite its simple graphics. And the horror-related graphical text adventures published by the Nihon Falcom Company, namely Horror House and Kyoki no Yakata, both from 1983, which might have been inspired by the similar-looking American graphical text adventure Mystery House from 1980, as well as Falcom's Demon's Ring from 1984, and Ichigen Kara no Dashutsu, also from 1984, with the latter sporting a fairly creepy premise and eerie imagery. And with that, I will conclude this video. In the next one, we will examine how, over the course of the next years, Japanese horror games eventually began to explore new cinematic and narrative possibilities. For that, I will mainly discuss two games in particular detail, one from 1989 and one from 1995. Which games, you ask? Well, I guess you'll just have to find out for yourself in the next video. Hope to see you then. And as always, take care and goodbye.